Now, when we work with depressed people using some methods involving non-ordinary states, like the breath work or psychedelic work or some other form of therapy that's experiential and induces a non-ordinary state, we'll find out that they will find some situations first from their postnatal biography which are similar to those that are described by psychoanalysis. A situation of emotional deprivation, of abandonment, of rejection, of some kind of oral frustration, some serious problems in the early relationship with the mother. But on the biographical level, we also find some elements that psychoanalysis does not emphasize, such as situations where they are victimized, not just psychologically, but physically, some kind of painful interventions and so on. And then, as the process goes deeper and reaches the perinatal level, a person who is in the inhibited depression will suddenly realize that on a deeper level, they are in the second perinatal matrix, which means what they start suddenly experiencing is that feeling of hopelessness and stuckness is really related to the situation of the first stage of biological delivery, where the uterus is contracting, is cutting off the blood supply, which means oxygen, nourishment, and the cervix is not open, a situation that feels unworkable, that feels absolutely hopeless. So depression seems to be like a projection of these feelings from an older situation into a current situation. And then suddenly we start understanding all the things which I described before, that this also could involve bioenergetic blockage. It's a situation that's very kind of hydraulic. You can also imagine how this situation would be physiologically blocking, why a person could have pressure headaches, why a person could experience pressure on the chest, pressure on the shoulders, why this should also be a situation associated with stress rather than just sort of a sense of extinction. Now, when we have a person who is in an agitated depression, again, usually through some biographical material involving some kind of violent encounters and so on, that person would realize that on a deeper level, they are actually connected to the third matrix, where there is still a sense of confinement, but now the cervix is open, and so the energetic system is at least partially capable to discharge some of these energies. Not completely. If a person in agitated depression could really let it all hang out, could really express it fully, they would move out of the depression. Because on the unconscious level, they would move from the third matrix to the fourth. The confinement, the entrapment would be completely liquidated. So this is a situation where there is a partial release and sort of outflowing of these previously pent-up emotions and energies. Now, this is also very closely related to suicide. We know that, with the exception of suicide that has some really serious rational reason, like a Jewish person who escaped from a Nazi camp and knows that in the next moment they're going to be captured, or a person who has some kind of very painful terminal disease and is facing sort of days of suffering, where we can somehow understand that that person could commit suicide. If that is absent, then suicide is typically related to depression. Now, we have two major problems that any kind of serious theory of suicide would have to explain. The first one is why anybody would want to kill himself or herself. Because this seems to violate the most powerful instinct in nature, which is the self-preservation instinct that really drives the whole wheel of evolution. But we have another even more interesting problem, which is why do people want to do it in a particular way? You see that people who are in a certain state of mind are attracted to a particular form of suicide. Let's say a person who would take an overdose of tranquilizers or barbiturates would not jump out of the window or under a train. Now, this might appear kind of understandable to us. If you just want to die, you find instead of, least gory kind of way to do it. But the opposite is also true, that a person who drives the car over the cliff, or the person who jumps out of the window or jumps under a train, would not take an overdose of drugs as a means to suicide, even if the drugs were available. So whether the person wants to commit suicide by hanging or drowning or by use of firearms, itself requires some kind of explanation. We can think in terms of two different types of suicide, like we distinguish the inhibited depression and the agitated depression. There are also two categories of suicide. One is non-violent suicide. And we'll find that this is something that's on the mind of people who are in the inhibited depression, who are under the influence of the second matrix. When they cannot take it anymore, they find ways out of the situation. Now, the least problematic one would be they would end up in bed, they want to be covered by a blanket, and they just want to stay there, don't want to face the light of the day. The next step would be maybe take an overdose of tranquilizers, of barbiturates, or drinking a lot of alcohol. The next step then would be being attracted to water, wanting to end it by drowning. I've also worked with people in Prague when there was winter with snow and so on, who had fantasies of walking into the snow and just sort of walking until they fall down, and then they would be covered with snow and they would kind of die there. The only bloody kind of suicide that is in this category was one that was in vogue kind of in ancient Rome, which is going into a bathtub with warm water and cutting the wrist so that the blood and the water kind of mix and we lose consciousness and kind of psychologically dissolve in the water. So how should we understand what is happening in people who are contemplating these kinds of forms of suicide? They are basically under the influence of the second matrix, which creates a lot of discomfort. And when they can't tolerate it anymore, the situation they're facing is that on the unconscious level, there is a memory that this situation wasn't always so, that before it was something that was better, particularly if it was a good womb, which was the prenatal situation. So they start looking for a way out that would bring in somehow the elements which on an unconscious level they remember from the prenatal state. So the most obvious one is water, because that is a situation where you're in water, then the idea is, you want to drown. The one with the walking in the snow also has a kind of a prenatal fantasy behind it, because the fantasy is that it might be cold at the beginning, but that suddenly sort of warmth come in, and the whole thing is just like a womb. The situation with the drugs, with alcohol, is very similar, because again, it starts kind of eliminating the painful feeling and creates a kind of a state of undifferentiated indifference, which is like a caricature of the prenatal state. So if we work with these people using non-ordinary state, once they get to this level, they realize they really didn't want to kill themselves. They somehow wanted to escape from the uncomfortable situation of the second matrix into a situation which would have the elements of the first matrix. And they are not in touch with the unconscious where it's happening, so they perceive the depression as something that's caused by the current circumstances, and they also look for the solution by looking for situations in everyday life that would bring in some of the elements of the prenatal state. Now, if we look at the person who is in the agitated depression, it's a very different situation.